Hi, I'm Philip Brasher, Executive Editor of Agri-Pulse Communications. Thank you for being with us today on our webinar, The Farm Bill, Where Are We Now? I'm really pleased to see the interest, but not at all surprised given the two experts who have graciously agreed to share their time with us today. I will first give some brief introductions to John and Jacqlyn, and then they will share, each of them share some analysis with us. And then we will move into a period of question and answer. Now, we want you to participate in asking questions. Please, you can offer your questions in the Q&A portion down in the center of the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, the Q&A function. If you're experiencing any technical issues, feel free to also use that Q&A question to ask for help. In addition, I want you to know that we will be recording today's discussion and the webinar will be available later at agripulse.com. So to start, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, John Newton. John serves as Chief Economist for the Senate Agriculture Committee under Ranking Member John Bozeman of Arkansas. John has served agriculture at a number of capacities over the last 2 decades, including several roles within USDA and as a 2-time award-winning faculty member at the University of Illinois. Most recently, prior to joining the committee, John served as the Chief Economist for the American Farm Bureau Federation. And in 2021, he received the Distinguished Alumni Award from The Ohio State University. John holds 2 master's degrees and a PhD from Ohio State. And I want to add this, there's an old joke around DC, something along the effect that there's, one version of it I think is if there's 2 people who understand dairy policy and both of them are retired, well, actually, John is somebody who does understand, cut his teeth on dairy policy. So if you want to ask about dairy policy, today's webinar will be the chance to do that. John?
Thank you, Philip. I try to forget as much dairy policy as I can, but no, thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you all today. I look forward to talking about the Farm Bill. And all eyes last week were on the CBO May baseline. This is the baseline that we will use to score the 2023 Farm Bill against. And when you look back, the 2018 Farm Bill at enactment scored at $867 billion over 10 years. And this next Farm Bill will be the first $1.5 trillion farm bill that we ever do, and in large part because of the significant increase in SNAP spending. But overall, you see at $1.5 trillion, the farm bill's increased in size by over 70%. And Megan, if we can move to the next slide, please. SNAP is a big reason why the farm bill has grown so much in size. The Thrifty Food Plan update that was conducted in August of 2021 increased SNAP spending by $300 billion. And to put that into perspective, that's more than we spend on every other title in the Farm Bill. So SNAP is certainly eating into the Farm Bill. It's eating into our capacity to do other things we'd like to do in the Farm Bill, including in the nutrition space. You think about adding additional fruits and vegetables and their availability, the GusNIP program. The SNAP program has gotten so large that it's eating into our capacity to do other things in the Farm Bill. And if we look, next slide, please, Megan. If we look at just SNAP and how it's grown over the years, SNAP has grown 84% since we did the 2018 Farm Bill. The Congressional Budget Office, their May baseline that was released last week, shows an 11-year score of SNAP at close to $1.4 trillion. And what was really interesting in the May baseline is compared to their February baseline, they made 2 major changes to SNAP. First, in fiscal year 2023, they increased SNAP participation by approximately 1 million people and increased SNAP outlays by $18 billion in a single year. So SNAP went from $127 billion in February, and then their May estimate, they raised it to $145 billion And then over the next 10-year period, they increased SNAP again by $18 billion. So combined from February to May, the Congressional Budget Office updated their forecast for SNAP spending by $36 billion, which again just demonstrates the magnitude of the SNAP program and its relationship to the Farm Bill. Again, over 80% of Farm Bill spending when you include the resources from the Inflation Reduction Act. Megan, if we go to the next slide. As it pertains to conservation and risk management outlays, the Congressional Budget Office did make some modifications to some commodity prices. And when you look, if we add the IRA resources that are conservation related, we're looking at conservation spending and IRA spending combined at close to $75 billion, which would make that the second largest title in the Farm Bill for farm-related provisions behind crop insurance. You can see that the Title I support that a lot of farmers depend on is not really expected to begin making program payments until 2026 or 2027. And that's a function of how those programs are designed. Farmers that plant a crop in 2024, that payment will be made in October of 2025, which is the 2026 fiscal year. So farmers do wait a good 18 months or so from when they put a crop in the ground to when program payments are delivered. But lower commodity prices, again, in the out years of the Farm Bill are expected to result in higher ARC and PLC payments from 2027 through 2033. We did also see in the baseline additional outlays for the dairy margin coverage program. CBO lowered milk prices. They lowered feed costs, but they also lowered the income over feed cost margin by a substantial amount and increased DMC outlays by approximately $1 billion or so over 10 years. And then they also essentially doubled outlays in the livestock disaster space. So the conservation and risk management outlays in the Farm Bill, again, a lot of that money is projected in the out years of the Farm Bill. And importantly, when you add in the IRA resources, we're looking at a conservation title that will now be second only to crop insurance in the farmer space. Maybe if we move to the next slide, please. If we look at farm spending by commodity in the February baseline, commodity level spending was approximately $56 billion. That doesn't include, ARC individual coverage, but strictly ARC, PLC, marketing loan programs, dairy safety net, and livestock disaster payments. When we moved to May, CBO updated their outlays for just about, they raised the outlays on corn to close to $25 billion, soybeans at $6 billion, wheat at $6 billion. Any of these pie charts that shows a plus symbol indicates that it's an increase from the baseline that we saw in February. And again, that's largely driven by updated price expectations for the commodities from their February to the May time period. If we move to the next slide, please. And this is exactly what we mean. So we sent a bipartisan letter to the Budget Committee earlier this year, identifying some of the price differences for major covered commodities relative to USDA. So the Congressional Budget Office had major commodity prices that were about 10 to 15% below those forecasted by the Department of Agriculture. And we highlighted that again in our views and estimates letter. And what we saw is updated price expectations for the major commodities from CBO in the May baseline. So over the 10-year period, they increased corn prices by about 1.4%. They raised soybean prices 1.3%. You can see a 4% decline in seed cotton, a slight increase on peanut prices. And then overall, you can see the dramatic declines that we saw across various aspects of the dairy safety net. And what that all really means is that from the February to the May baseline, the price expectations that we have today are not going to change by any meaningful way the scores on what improvements to Title I may be relative to what the scores were in February. We simply didn't see, price increases that were high enough to really lower those CBO scores. But what it doesn't change is what we've heard, I think, from farmers across the country. Senator Bozeman was in Nebraska last week. He was in North Carolina last week. He was in Iowa. He's in Minnesota. He's going to have listening sessions across the country. And one of the things that every single farmer has told us is we have to improve the safety net. We have to make this a farm bill for the farmers. Input costs continue to be at or near record highs. And with commodity prices where they are today, there's certainly a lot of concern that when this is the most expensive crop that you put in the ground, you have to do something to address the risk management tools that are available to producers. We didn't see a meaningful change in prices from the Congressional Budget Office, but that doesn't change the underlying need to do something in this farm bill that helps farmers. If we move to the next slide, please. There are, of course, new resources in the Farm Bill, or available for the Farm Bill, I should say. The Inflation Reduction Act had close to $37 billion in additional budget authority. There was $13 billion in rural development, $5 billion in forestry, more than $18 billion in the conservation space. And there will be an effort to move these resources into the Farm Bill to create permanent baseline. When you look at the May projection of IRA outlays, CBO did not change their expectations of how the IRA dollars are going to be spent over the next 10-year period. So all of those resources do remain available to move into the Farm Bill. I think the challenge is, this is a bipartisan farm bill. Farm bills have always been bipartisan. If we're going to move those resources into the Farm Bill, it should be part of a bipartisan conversation that includes input from stakeholders, which during the IRA process, quite frankly, did not happen. So there are resources available to move into the Farm Bill, but it will be part of a bipartisan process on the committee. And if we move to the next slide, please, Megan. And lastly, just to kind of round out, we also got, complete spending of the federal government over the next 10 years in May CBO update. And what we saw is if you take the conservation title, including the IRA, you take the income support programs in the Farm Bill, you take crop insurance, farm spending as a function of all federal spending over the next decade is 0.3%. And when you add in the SNAP program, when you add in child nutrition programs, we're at about 2.5% of total spending. So it's a small price to pay for food security. Senator Bozeman often says that food security is national security, and these elements help to ensure we have an abundant, safe, reliable, high quality food supply, and that we're able to meet the needs of our hungry. So if we move to the next slide, please, Megan. We all of these slides that were presented here today are available on our website. We just launched a new page where you can see our analysis of the CBO baseline. We did an analysis last week on farm production expenses. So we'll continue to keep folks updated and informed as timely issues arise in the ag space, especially as they relate to farm policy. So Phil, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and really do look forward to all the questions we get from the audience.
Thank you, John. Now we have Jacqlyn Schneider. Jacqlyn is a partner in FGS Global's food and agriculture practice based here in Washington. She spent more than 16 years leading food and ag policy on Capitol Hill, most recently as deputy staff director for the Senate Ag Committee and Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow. In her role on the committee, Jacqlyn directed the chairwoman's work on all food and ag issues, including nutrition, with an emphasis on infant and child nutrition, as well as a broad portfolio that included specialty crops, local, regional, and organic foods, climate and conservation, dairy, labor, immigration reform, and also addressing the need for increased support for minority and underserved farmers. In addition to her work on several farm bills, Jacqlyn also oversaw development and passage of a variety of key nutrition and climate bills, including the Access to Baby Formula, Keep Kids Fed, and a rather minor piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act, which we will discuss, I think, at a little more length. Prior to joining the Senate staff, Jacqlyn served as legislative director for Representative Jim Costa, a senior member of House Agriculture Committee, and earlier in her career worked for the Biotechnology Industry Organization. Welcome, Jacqlyn, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you all for having me here today. I wanted to start out with a little bit of a conversation about SNAP because as happens in every farm bill, and certainly something I think we're going to discuss again, and as John did in his presentation, there's a lot of conversation about what portion of SNAP is represented in the Farm Bill versus other portions of the Farm Bill, ranging from crop programs, research, energy programs, conservation, et cetera. So this chart is kind of something that you've seen many times. I think you've probably seen the purple and the brown section broken down into various different pieces. But this is something that I think you probably have seen fairly regularly as a pie chart. But I think it's really important for us also to start to not only look at the macro of what SNAP represents within the Farm Bill, but also the micro, because when we're talking about SNAP benefits, it's easy to talk about the overall piece of the pie, but what we're really talking about here is people, right? And what the level of benefit is that each individual received. So on the macro level, there's 42.3 million people that receive SNAP. So that large piece of the pie actually represents a lot of people that receive a very low level of support, about $6 a day. In order to qualify for SNAP, you can make a maximum of 130% of poverty. So, think about how low that is. That's under $19,000 a year for gross income in order to qualify. And the average SNAP benefit is $195 a month. So, just think about a little bit in terms of what that 80% represents. These are the numbers that actually fill in there. So SNAP is both an economic driver and a support for families. So when you're talking about what the impact is on farmers, on the farm economy, on the food economy, we also need to represent that those dollars are not only supporting families, but they're also putting a return back in farmers and the food economy pocket. So that's part of the reason that it's a part of the Farm Bill in the first place. It does actually support farmers and the food supply chain. Next slide, please. So just to talk about a little bit more, if this big pie is representative of the entire Farm Bill spending, that little arrow would be pointing at the amount that the average participant receives in SNAP benefits. And you can't see it because it's so infinitesimally small as a measure of the entire Farm Bill when you actually break it down to the micro level, that we really are talking about individuals that receive a very low level of support. So, for folks that are participating in commodity programs, crop insurance, conservation programs, just think about a little bit of what the support levels are that you might receive through one of the programs that help farmers stay in business. These numbers are pretty small, helping families in order to purchase the food that they need for their family's survival. So a couple more facts. 90% of households on SNAP have children, older adults, or disabled adults in the household. Work is something that we hear fairly regularly in conversation points about what needs to happen within the SNAP program. 74% of people who participate in SNAP work either before or after their participation in the SNAP program, before or after the year that they participate. And a good portion of folks that are participating in SNAP are also working as they're participating, because this is not only a support for people who aren't able to work, but also a support for families that are receiving low wages and need a little bit of help in order to support their families. Next slide, please. We did talk about baselines here, and John did an excellent job of walking through some of the details of what CBO released on Friday. Couple things that I think is worth noting here. The Farm Bill was adjusted both on the nutrition side, but also on the farm support side. So if you look at the increase that the February to May baseline changed, it was about a 1.5% increase in the SNAP program. That's largely represented by higher than expected participation level in the early years of the 10-year baseline window. SNAP is a lagging indicator. So as the economy recovers from challenging times and recessions, we frequently see SNAP lagging in its transition back to a normal baseline. And this is largely because people do tend to take a little bit of time to continue to participate on SNAP before they get their wages to a level that that constitute their ability to move fully off of the program. So you do see a little bit of a lag, and I think CBO adjusted based on the additional participation. And one of the things that I think is also important to note when you're thinking about the nutrition baseline that was released, for a good amount of time, we've been operating under a very different SNAP program because of the pandemic. And in February, the increased benefits that were allocated to families as a result of the pandemic are going away. So that was represented by about a $95 a month cut in average SNAP benefits for a family, so pretty significant. With the expiration of the public health emergency, some of the other flexibilities that existed in SNAP related to work requirements and college students and what their participation really needs to be is also going away. So you're seeing major changes to the SNAP program that will have a pretty significant impact on families going forward. I think another thing that is important to note, just as we're talking about baselines and how they may change and how CBO may revise some of their estimates, I think the conversation point about what CBO estimated for the Farm Bill when the Farm Bill was passed versus where we are now, it's not unusual to see changes. We saw a change just from February to May of 15% for the commodity programs because there's new assumptions. So we do regularly see some adjustments in how the baseline is evaluated. I think we saw the same thing in some of the commodity programs, taking a look at where CBO had scored the commodity programs at the conclusion of the 2018 Farm Bill versus how they score the commodity and crop insurance programs now. Next slide. So one of the main things that is being discussed, I think, in the context of the debt ceiling conversations, but certainly I would imagine would come up in Farm Bill conversations, is work requirements in SNAP. And I thought it was important just to highlight what work requirements actually exist in the SNAP program already. Sometimes with the conversations around debt ceiling, the details are being muddied a bit between different programs, Medicaid, TANF, SNAP. So I thought it was important just to highlight a little bit of what already exists without any changes to the programs. There's two different types of work requirements. There's general work requirements that apply to everyone ages 16 to 59 that states get to choose how they administer some of these requirements. But there are general work requirements for everyone who falls into the category on the left, and requirements for exactly what they need to do within the program. I think the most common conversation point around work requirements tend to focus on the able-bodied adults without dependents. So these are folks that don't have children. This is the area that is most specifically touched as a part of the House package related to the debt ceiling. These requirements are actually pretty harsh. You are only allowed to receive SNAP for 3 months out of every 3 years if you're not able to work an average of 20 hours a week over the course of the month. So, just think in terms of what that means for an individual and a family. Many of the folks that face some of the challenges with these work requirements have unstable work conditions, so may have variable hours, may have ongoing challenges that do not make them disabled. Veterans, folks that have some complications in the workforce circumstance. So there are already pretty strict work requirements that exist. And as we're looking at the history of the work requirements related to able-bodied adults without dependents, we really do have a history of, in times of Great Recession, for example, in times of economic hardship, some of these requirements tend to be waived more frequently, and then they tend to return back to a regular average and baseline level. And I think the expectation is post the pandemic emergency expiring that we'll see some similar trends related to the use of the state waivers, which are state options. They're not required, but they are state options that governors may choose when states or specific areas are facing economic hardship. So I think that all of these things are going to factor into the conversation going on with the debt ceiling and the Farm Bill. The debt ceiling conversations, I think, are particularly potent, not only for the impacts on the nutrition assistance programs, but also the potential risk for farm programs as well. Looking back on previous debt ceiling fights, I think one of the things that that many of you probably remember during the previous fight, there was an imposition of a 5.7% reduction through sequestration, which impacted all farm programs. And that's something that's been extended many times after the time that it was supposed to expire, and is staying on the books. So as we're talking about the potential risk for broad swaths of cuts across all mandatory or discretionary programs that can have lasting impacts. And the risk for a potential default is certainly something that I think we all need to take into consideration for the risk for farm lending in a time when there's concerns over high input costs. A huge spike in interest rates and lending rates certainly would have a tremendous impact on farm programs. I think looking forward, as John mentioned, the IRA was a big infusion of money into Farm Bill related programs. While it is not in the Farm Bill baseline, that money did funnel into programs that are within the Farm Bill, like EQIP, working lands conservation programs that have been things that we've heard over and over that farmers wanted to participate in. Wildfire prevention programs, some really important stuff. So I do think that it's going to be an important topic for conversation, but it is something that's directly related to farming and working lands programs that does support farmers, and had over 1,700 groups that signed a letter in support of those provisions because they did provide a good amount of input. And I think the last thing I'll say before I turn it back to Phil is I think the committees will be doing a good amount of due diligence, looking at all of the numbers, all of the needs, certainly wanting to be targeted and weigh what farmers and families are looking for. There's both a farm and a family safety net in the Farm Bill. I think we've also seen reports not only of high input costs, but also record high profits at over 26% over the 20-year average. So certainly some targeted approaches are probably warranted, taking a look at some of those input costs and where the effects are, and trying to make sure that we're targeting the assistance to places that it's really necessary and needed, and that meets the needs of the farmers that are weighing in with the committees. And I think certainly putting on my former Senate Agriculture Committee hat, if there's anyone who can accomplish that, I think Senator Boozman and Senator Stabenow certainly have a long history of working together through some pretty complex issues. So I'm very hopeful that they'll be able to achieve that. But I do think the debt ceiling conversations are probably going to have some impacts, just delaying the process on how that unfolds. So with that, I'll turn it back to Phil.
Thank you, Jacqlyn. Now we'll move to questions. I wanted to start off with a question for both of you. And Jacqlyn, I'll start off with you, and then John. And keep those questions coming in. We have some good ones, and we'll jump right into those in a second. But I wanted to ask each of you, starting with you, Jacqlyn, what do you see as the timetable now of going forward for moving a farm bill, for getting one out of the House and Senate Ag committees, and what do you see as the biggest barriers at this point, tripwires, however you want to look at it? Start with you, Jackie. When are we going to get a bill passed? I think everybody on this call would like to know.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the committees are certainly doing their due diligence to try to work through the input that they're receiving and a series of hearings. I think the Senate has certainly been aggressive in their calendar and have worked through at the full committee level and working at the subcommittee level to try and do hearings on all of the topics relevant to the Farm Bill. I do think that the debt ceiling conversation has a big impact. It's hard to know what position you're negotiating from or to until some key decisions are made about what that looks like going forward. And I certainly think that has delayed the process and just finalizing some of the details. If I had to put on my hat, I would say my prediction hat, probably September 2023 is a bit ambitious and might be challenging. I'll let John speak to where things are on the workflow, but I do think that the committees are working as quickly as they can. But I think that we're probably looking at a delayed farm bill, maybe into 2024.
Okay, Jacqlyn, before we get to that, how concerned are you that last time the negotiations were held up with this issue with it's not just the work requirements, but there were categorical eligibility, a number of other issues, all related to SNAP restrictions that the House Ag Committee wanted to put on SNAP. Are the dynamics different this time with the two committees, or between the House and the Senate? How do you see that playing out?
You know, I don't think this fight is new. We've seen it in multiple farm bills. I think one of the things that is very clear from the data is the mandatory work requirements and some of the changes and cuts do a good deal of harm and don't necessarily bring some of the outcomes that I think some of the folks proposing some of those cuts and changes intended. And there's pretty strong opposition. So with a narrow margin in the House and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic White House, I don't think that you'll see drastic cuts to nutrition programs in a bill that gets across the finish line. I think the chairwoman has said pretty clearly that that she intends to protect the integrity of nutrition assistance programs. And, you know, historically, there's a reason that during things like Simpson Bowls and other budget conversations that SNAP has been excluded from some of those cuts. And that's because they're important anti-poverty programs that provide a big return for the economy. So I think that there's always a risk, but I think there's probably solutions that address some of the bipartisan issues within the committee's jurisdiction, even in nutrition assistance programs. John mentioned some, the GusNIP program incentives, some things around technology, some spaces where you could come together and make positive progress for the SNAP program without attacking benefits and access.
Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to SNAP in a minute, but John, what's your forecast?
Well, I think Jacqueline's exactly right. I mean, staff is working as hard as we can, as fast as we can. We're taking all the stakeholder inputs. We're doing subcommittee hearings. We have one again this week. But the reason why we have to work so fast, Phil, is we spent the better part of the last 2 years doing reconciliation when we should have had stakeholder hearings on the Farm Bill and what folks needed. We didn't do that. So now we're doing listening sessions around the country. Senator Bozeman's traveling to so many states to get the input he needs. Staff is working extremely hard to get this bill done. And then the other reason, Phil, that it's a priority is, look, nutrition programs continue. Conservation programs were extended to 2031 in the Inflation Reduction Act. The reason to do a farm bill now, and Senator Bozeman said it a number of times, is for the farmers. We're not going to do a farm bill if we don't do something to help the farmers. So we are working as fast as we can, getting all that stakeholder input so that we can get a farm bill done on time that helps the farmers.
Okay. Let's turn to the funding, the Inflation Reduction Act, that pot of money. We have a question about the $37 billion that you mentioned, John, that's in there for conservation, forestry, and energy. What is, I'd like to start with you, John, on the question, just the mechanics of that's not in the Farm Bill, it's sitting outside of the Farm Bill. That money is going to be spent. If nothing happens, that USDA is going to spend that money, or most of it, on their own. They don't need any additional authority. What's the benefit for bringing that into the Farm Bill, and what are the mechanics? Can you bring all of that entire funding into the Farm Bill? Could you bring a portion of it? How does that work? And then Jacqlyn, I'd like you to kind of address the politics, the policy, and how the chairwoman would likely view that. John?
Well, Phil, I certainly think there's a role for the the budget committee in making that decision on whether those resources can move into the farm bill. But mechanically, you can repeal it. That creates a reduction in our federal debt, reduction in the outlay, so to speak, and then you can turn around and re-spend it in the farm bill with no impact on the deficit. That's exactly how that would work. I think if you can come to a bipartisan way to use those resources, it's not a tall task. It's not a tall cliff to climb to get those resources into the farm bill.
Jacqlyn, how would the chairwoman's likely view of that be? What concerns do you think she would have about doing that? Why not just move it into the farm bill? Potentially, if you could permanently increase the baseline.
So I think those are all conversations that will be had. I think one of the things to keep in mind is those resources were allocated where they were allocated for very specific purposes. The mechanics of moving it into the farm bill, I certainly think that there's some benefits to having ongoing baseline. I think one of the concerns may be what the potential impacts are to the programs that were funded. I would say programs like EQIP were received a huge increase in funding, and we know that the EQIP program is 3 times oversubscribed, and so there is an impact. It's not a potential trade-off without a potential impact, depending on how those funds are allocated. So I do think that that's something that will be discussed, and the pros and cons weighed on whether it makes sense to do it. But I think first and foremost, I would imagine the chairwoman would say, we want to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to address the climate crisis. And that was the intention of the IRA funds. And something that would change the intention would be challenging for a lot of the members in those 1,700 groups that supported those efforts.
Phil, I'll add that the reason to do it and the reason to move it to the farm bill, if you don't, those funds, they expire. After 2031, no more dollars can go out the door. If you move it into the farm bill, you do potentially create permanent baseline that continues. It won't run out. So that's the incentive to move it into the farm bill.
Yeah, certainly. And I think the protections that were included as a part of IRA are important to protect as well. So I think any conversation that would probably be had would probably involve questions around whether or not the intention of addressing the climate crisis would also be a part of that.
It's part of a bipartisan bill.
Absolutely.
John, we have a question that one of the first questions that came in was about dairy margin coverage program. Could you talk about how the dairy margin coverage program and because there are some folks who would like to see some changes and modifications to that program, kind of raising to bring in more producers under that tier 1, which is the highest level of support. There's also been some producers talking about wanting to do a update of their production so that they can get coverage on more production. What does this baseline mean for the cost of doing that? And also, you also mentioned the livestock disaster assistance, that the cost of that had doubled. What does that mean for wanting to do any changes to those livestock disaster programs?
Well, that's a great question. So if you think back to when CBO did their baseline in February, and then when they updated in May, we've now seen a $3 per hundredweight payment from the DMC program last month due to rapidly declining milk prices. Feed prices remain elevated, and that's what's resulting in the large DMC payments that we've seen. And I think CBO now incorporates that into their projections. They have falling feed prices, they have falling milk prices, falling margins. And so ultimately what that's going to do, Phil, is it's going to make it more costly to do any of the changes on the dairy safety net that you mentioned, whether it's modifying the production history so that it's more up to date, or changing the coverage levels. Any of those changes to DMC are going to be more expensive now because CBO raised the cost of about $1 billion over 10.
And same with the livestock disaster programs.
Exactly.
Yeah. want to turn to specialty crops, fruits and vegetables, primarily. Jacqlyn, we have a question about what can be done in those areas. What do you see as the highest priorities for the committees on addressing with specialty crops? I mean, the Specialty Crop Farm Bill Coalition came in with a long list covering most of the titles of the Farm Bill. But what do you see are likely to be the highest priorities, the most doable?
You know, the specialty crop industry has always been a little unique since they don't participate in traditional Title I programs. So the touch on all portions of the Farm Bill is a little bit by design. They've always been focused on tools to mitigate risk, to invest in conservation where they need technology, addressing issues related to labor, research needs that go into things like mechanization, support for the purchase of fruits and vegetables, expanding things like incentive programs that maximize the dollars that can be spent on healthy food. So I'd imagine, their priorities are long because the industries are diverse and they don't have a direct shot in the same way some other commodities do within the Title I program. So, but I do know that they have a great challenge with labor shortages right now. And so a good amount of research needs related to pest and disease and labor issues, mechanization issues, and looking to expand markets. The specialty crop industry has always been looking both domestically and abroad for ways to maximize their opportunities to sell. So I think you'll see a good combination of efforts around some of those key areas. But it might vary a bit depending on who you ask, which rises up to the top, the middle, and the bottom of those key areas. But there's been a growing bipartisan support in the House and Senate for specialty crop issues over the years. So I think that's why they've had some success in trying to improve their programs.
Is there anything, we had a question about fruits and vegetables when it comes to nutrition assistance and SNAP. There have been some proposals, some folks wanting to kind of provide more incentives within the SNAP program to buy produce, fruits and vegetables. Also, you mentioned the GUSNIP, the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program that provides some incentives to buy fruits and vegetables. Also, there's produce prescription program that's been kind of operating under that umbrella. What do you see potentially happening there in the nutrition assistance space?
There is a good amount of bipartisan support for expansion of some of those programs. I think the real question is what are the funding needs and what is possible within the scope of the Farm Bill. But this is an area where we've seen a variety of members on the House and Senate side that have weighed in support in previous years and also continue to support looking forward at this Farm Bill. So I feel like this is an area where there could be a bright spot of some positive momentum around looking at the support that the SNAP program provides and what can maximize the amount of dollars that go directly into farmers' hands that grow fruits and vegetables as well.
And while we're on SNAP, we have a question about, Jacqlyn, do you have a breakdown of the 42.3 million people on SNAP in terms of the number of children, disabled, ABODs, so forth, roughly?
It is about 90% that fall into one of those categories. Over 50% of the program are families that have children. So you are talking very much about a program that supports families, children, parents of children, parents who are caring for elderly relatives. So about 90% represents that collective. I don't know the exact number of seniors versus disabled, but it is over 50% of families with children as well.
Philip, the pre-pandemic stats on SNAP showed about 7% of the participants were in that ABOD category. But back to your previous question, the challenge with all these things that Jacqlyn talked about, on the fruit and vegetable space, you need more resources. And when SNAP is already over $1.2 trillion, it crowds out the ability to do anything else that you want to do on the nutrition space. And that really is a challenge this year in particular.
Just note one thing though, SNAP growing doesn't actually crowd out anything because the overall farm bill gets larger. So the pie actually increases across the board. So we don't actually have to, if SNAP goes up because of inflation or increased participation, it doesn't take away from another program within the farm bill. So
no, but the appetite to keep spending more money changes, Jacqueline. I mean, that's the reality of
it.
Okay. Let's move on to commodity question. We have not talked much about the commodity title, John, in terms of the chairman has said over and over that not the chairman, the ranking member, very distinct difference there. The ranking member, Senator Boozman, has said over and over he's not going to support a farm bill that doesn't address reference prices in the price loss coverage program that trigger payments when market prices fall below those in a particular year. We had estimates. Bart Fisher at Texas A&M estimates kind of a back of the envelope estimate that it would cost about $10 billion or $20 billion to do a 10% increase in reference prices, $50 billion to do a 20% increase. Is there any change in this CBO baseline? It doesn't sound like it from what you're saying. This doesn't really affect the cost of doing that across the board. Could you address also, you can also just address the escalator, the effective reference price that can float. It's now capped at 15% of the 15% over the statutory reference price. Is that any easier to do? And how does this latest CBO baseline play into either of those options?
We've looked at a variety of options in that space. And CBO score, it is what it is. But one of the things is we talked to other experts, and I can tell you that you call Pat Westhoff at FAPRI, and he's about half of where CBO is on scoring some of these things. So a lot of it has to do with their price expectations, which we pointed out in our views and estimates letter. We're 10 to 15% below USDA's estimates. Their distributional assumptions are different, but you're exactly right. Nothing in the prices that we got out of CBO dramatically changes the Farm Bill math in terms of modifications to Title I programs.
What is the challenge? This is to either one of you. What is the challenge of can you do some? Can you raise some without raising all of them? What's the politics there? What is staff? What do you have to think about there?
I'll tell you what Senator Boozman said, and as blunt as I can say it, is he's not going to vote for a farm bill that doesn't take care of farmers. And we're working as best as we can to try to do that. We don't have a final blueprint yet on what that looks like. We're continuing to meet with stakeholders, but I think we'll be there soon.
Okay. We have a question about the export promotion programs, market access program and the foreign market development program, those two programs that help commodity groups promote their products overseas. There's a pretty across the board proposals to desire to double the spending on those two programs. What are the chances of that? Jacqueline, how do you see that playing out?
So, I think this really comes down to where priorities are. So I'd say the market promotion programs are also programs that help farmers. So when we're talking about what programs actually support farmers and the farm economy, we have to be careful how we parse that. I don't think that reference prices alone are the only way to support farmers. The market access program, for example, does have good bipartisan support and a variety of farmers from a whole host of different commodities that are asking for some increases there. So when we're talking about what farm support is, I think I would put this in that category as well. So I might ask John what his prognostications on that one is, because it is a farm-based program that has gotten a good deal of support from the farmers directly.
Oh yeah, I think there's a ton of support for MAP and FMD programs, and again, as Jacqueline said, this is another one of the needs that farmers have. We're going to have a record large trade deficit this year, so it's critically important that we have the resources that we need to find and develop new markets around the world. Trade agreements would probably also help in that space as well in terms of finding and building new markets. But it's more than ARC and PLC, as Jacqueline said. It's trade. Animal disease preparedness and responses is another big thing that we need to invest in. So there are a lot of needs for farmers that need to be addressed this farm bill, and that's Senator Bozeman's priority.
Okay, we have a question about the WTO and our U.S. WTO commitments under WTO rules and how those play into our thinking on commodity programs, commodity spending. John, are we still, there were limits obviously on price or market distorting subsidies on how much we agreed to spend on those. So is that still in play, or do we still?
Oh, I think, Philip, we're way below the de minimis levels to even have any kind of concern there.
Because of our, urban agriculture. Do we see any more, Jacqueline, do you see any more? That was something that really was new coming into the last 2018 Farm Bill, I believe. What do you see? We have there's a lot of growth of controlled environment agriculture, indoor agriculture, and a number of places where Walmart and other major retailers are looking for locally produced produce. Do you see anything? What do you see in terms of policy on that, on urban ag going? Urban and indoor, I would put it all together.
Yeah, this is a place where there's been some tremendous innovation and creativity on how to maximize yields in small spaces and really utilize some technology and also build a sustainable ecosystem in communities. And a good example of where a little bit of resources can go a long way. So the last Farm Bill was the first time that there was officially an infusion of funds in the establishment of the Urban Ag Office. And there's been some great work going on, not only with the Farm Bill resources and what USDA has been doing, but at the grassroots level on the ground with folks who are working in ag technology, as you mentioned, the controlled environment agriculture work, ways to sort of really utilize the space in urban areas to maximize production, and certainly something that I think has been welcome in a lot of communities. And I think you'll continue to see interest in this and growth in this area as both the demand for local food systems and locally produced food continues to grow, and also the interest in farming for folks that are younger, which is certainly something that is necessary in the agricultural sphere. You see a huge influx of new and beginning farmers coming into sort of this innovative and urban agriculture, local ag systems, diversified agriculture. That tends to be an area of growth. I think folks in the credit markets and beginning farmer associations have noticed that you do tend to find a lot of younger farmers entering the market, entering the agriculture industry through some of those fields. So something we certainly want to encourage so we can continue to facilitate a new generation of farmers.
Philip, can I add something on that?
Yeah,
real quick?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
We had a group of farmers in a couple of weeks ago from Texas, and this is pretty telling. One of the children of the farmer that came to visit with us did not want to take over the farm. Very successful farm operation in Texas, but the kid did not want to take over the farm. And it's because of the environment that we're in. They don't have access to risk management tools that work and reflect the realities that they face. We look at interest rates that are the highest some of these people have ever seen in their lifetime. So it's a very, very challenging environment to get in the farming. The average USDA operating loan's over $330,000. So people are effectively taking out a mortgage every single year, and they don't know if Mother Nature is going to cooperate. We need to make sure that this farm bill improves the safety nets so that these young farmers can have economic opportunities back home in rural America. It's so important. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a big priority of Senator Bozeman is that this farm bill is an opportunity to make sure there are economic opportunities in agriculture and in rural America.
Bipartisan interest. We see a good amount of interest in trying to find innovative options and really target resources, right? I think that's really the crux of trying to provide support where it's needed. When you do see record high at net farm profits, there are certainly some folks who are in need of some new assistance and some targeted assistance. But I think we also want to make sure that it's targeted to where the need is and where you can get the best bang for your buck. So
the statistic's a little misleading, Jacqueline. The average rate of return on farm assets is 2%. So to put that into perspective, you'd have to borrow, tens of millions of dollars to get where that net farm income shows you. So just keep in mind, these farmers are taking out massive amounts of debt for razor thin margins.
I want to turn to crop insurance real quick. We have not talked about that. That program has really grown dramatically over the last, certainly over the last decade. And you all have watched that. Jacqueline, we've had a number of, in the last two farm bills, had some debates, particularly in 2014, a little less though in 2018, but a number of proposals to either cut premium subsidies to higher income, some built around some kind of means testing. Do you see, have the politics moved at all, shifted in terms of crop insurance as it's grown and touched more states and so forth, or can we expect similar proposals this time around?
I do think there's a good amount of support for crop insurance across the board. It is an area where we've seen growth into new areas, new risk management tools for fruit and vegetable growers, some attempts to try and better address organic farming and the local farm communities with risk management. I think anytime you have a large program, there's always attention on what the requirements are, what the allocations are. But I do think there's a good amount of bipartisan support for crop insurance. I wouldn't be surprised if there's proposals that are offered simply because there's some juxtaposition between what is being proposed on the farm side and the family side sometimes that I think there's certainly some members that would make some comparisons, be it through crop insurance or through some of the Title I programs as the debates continue. But again, I do think there's a good amount of bipartisan support for crop insurance.
I agree 100%. Lots of support. There's also, I think when you look at all the ad hoc support that's gone out the door the last few years, there's a recognition that crop insurance needs to be enhanced for folks. We need to make sure people are getting the coverage they need so they don't have to rely on ad hoc support 2 or 3 years after a disaster.
We had a quick question here on hemp. Can't let you guys go without that. Do you see anything? We had a big topic of discussion in the last farm bill. The industry has kind of struggled a bit since then. Do you see anything in this farm bill on hemp addressing some of the issues that they have? Either of you?
I'm close enough to Leader McConnell's office to maybe get an answer through osmosis, but I'll probably defer to his folks on that one.
He certainly has enthusiasm, so I imagine whatever happens in the farm bill, he will have influence over and conversations about. But I'm not sure. It's a complicated area.
Question on ag research. A number of the groups have asked for mandatory funding. I would suspect the appropriators are going to push back against that. What are the chances for increased and even mandatory funding on for research? Either of you.
Jacqueline, you can commit to those new dollars, right?
Oh, I would say there's always been interest and certainly some arguments on the pros and cons. And I'm sure a lot of the folks who would like mandatory money would be happy if the appropriators provided increases in funding. So we'll see how that all plays out, but it's certainly a resource draw in a challenging environment sometimes.
But I think it points to, Philip, the needs across agriculture. We don't do farm bills every single year. We do them, hopefully every 5 years. And that's an opportunity to look back and say, here are the resources we need, for the future of agriculture. And, I hate to keep talking about reference prices, but if we don't look at those today in this next farm bill, by the time we do another farm bill, they'll be close to 20 years old. So now's the opportunity to revisit how the farm safety net works. The information that we're using is over a decade old. And again, I think that's one of the priorities, for us, is to make sure that the safety net works.
It's over 50 years since the Thrifty was updated. So certainly understand.
Thrifty food plan. That's a whole nother webinar. We'll do that one later.
By the nose, Thrifty.
Yeah, our time is over, and I'd like to thank both of you, Jacqlyn and John, for being with us today and for this discussion. And thank you for all of you that are online for participating. It's really a pleasure. In case you missed a portion of the event or would like to share the conversation with friends, we'll be posting a recording, as I said earlier, on agripulse.com. You will receive an email when it's ready and available. Thank you all, and have a great day.